Hello and welcome. My name is Amelia Larson. I serve as the Executive Vice President of Innovations and Academic Partnerships at American Reading Company. Thank you for joining us today. First, a little bit of housekeeping. We will be recording today's session. You will receive an email with the link to the recording, along with resources and information regarding our next webinar. During our time together today, please feel free to submit your comments and questions in the chat box. Dr. Lucia Messinger will be monitoring the chat, and there will be time for some conversation. And if you are on social media, remember to use ArcLearns, hashtag ArcLearns, as you share your learning. As a grandmother of emergent bilinguals, I am especially excited about today's webinar. One of the most important attributes of emergent bilingual learners is that they come to school with two languages. Once they are in school, research has overwhelmingly established that emergent bilingual children are best served when both of their languages are used for instruction. And yet, our field has become increasingly dichotomized over the years, and English medium programs have become synonymous with English only. Well, how is that working for us? The stakes could not be higher, and today it is my honor to introduce you to our outstanding guests and academic advisory board members to expand on this important issue. Dr. Jim Cummings is a professor emeritus at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education of the University of Toronto, Canada. His research focuses on literacy development, and he has been a driving force behind bilingual education for the past 4 decades. Over the past 25 years, he has worked with teachers to identify ways of increasing the literacy engagement of learners in multilingual school contexts. In his most recent book, Rethinking the Education of Multilingual Learners, a critical analysis of theoretical concepts, was published this past August. Dr. Kathy Escamilla is a professor emerita in equity, bilingualism, and biliteracy at the University of Colorado Boulder. Her research centers on educational issues related to Spanish-speaking emergent bilingual students, and she's specifically interested in issues related to the development of bilingualism and biliteracy in early elementary grades. Her research has also examined assessment practices and the impact of high-stakes testing on these children. She has published 4 books and over 50 articles in research journals. We are just so excited to have you. So thank you so much. And to kick us off, Mario.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mario Palma. I'm the Vice President of Multilingual Teaching and Learning for the American Reading Company. I identify as a New York City born, Cuban, simultaneous bilingual, hopeless romantic, with a positive attitude that we can actually build from the assets of our multilingual learners to help them achieve academically. So we're reminded with the data that came out from the most recent US Census that our classrooms are going to be over 50% linguistically, racially, and culturally diverse. The timing for these types of conversations couldn't be better. And so we asked our guest speakers today to start us off by providing us with a big picture, where we have been, what do we currently know about the research, and what essentially is at stake. So I'll invite Dr. Escamilla to begin.
All right, look at me. All right, in under 20 minutes. Okay, again, I'm happy to be here. I was asked in 10 minutes or less, and if you know me, it's hard for me to say anything in 10 minutes or less, to talk a little bit about how we leverage assets and accelerate learning for emerging bilingual learners. And around 3 topics: what we know, sort of like our KLW charts, what we know, what do we need to learn from the past, and what's at stake. And the stakes, as Amelia said, could not be higher with regard to what we need to be doing. So I'm going to just start with, we all know that our kids are in 2 different kinds of programs, Some of them are in programs where are in what we call English medium, where English is the medium of instruction, but somehow we have been taught or learned over the past that we should never use any language other than English. And I'm here to tell you that I think that that's one of our big mistakes, that there are ways that we can leverage children's assets. And one of their assets is what we call their non-English language or their lote. And then there are kids, precious few, and hopefully more in the future, who are in some sort of bilingual program or a dual language program in which both of their languages can be used as mediums of instruction. And finally, in the recent past, we have decided that bilingualism and biliteracy as an ultimate outcome of these programs is what we want, not Spanish to be used until English can replace Spanish. That's not what we want to be doing. Okay, so what we know is that it is not enough for us to do reading instruction, that we need a broader program that's a literacy program. For although in this country we frequently talk about literacy, 64% of the instructional time in the past 30 or 40 years that's called literacy has really been spent on reading. So we know that emerging bilingual kids need to learn to read, absolutely. But as a part of learning to read, they need English language development, or as we call it in Literacy Squared, oracy. They need writing, and they need to learn metalinguistic development, how language works. And that includes how language works within your language and across languages. They need to learn for reading, not just for sounding out words. They need to see themselves in the curriculum. And I know that Jim has been doing a lot of work on this, on identity development, but they need to see themselves in the curriculum as readers and writers and literate people. And they need to have their first languages valued and used in the classroom, even if they're English medium. Now, what do I mean by that? Forever, we have known that if we ask children to read in a language they are not very familiar with, and then put them in groups of kids and say, talk to each other about what you've just read, and allow them to use their non-English language, that improves their comprehension. Why? Because we know that talking about what you think you just read is a way of accelerating your progress. And yet too often we feel like if children are using their non-English languages in the classroom, that's wasting their time, or that's time that could be used teaching in English. So we need to have their first languages valued. A first language is a very valuable thing if we're reading a book in English in school and we can send home the companion book in another language to parents to read at home. We know how valuable that is. We know how that improves comprehension. And why do we teach kids to read anyway? And that is to comprehend text. And to talk about what they're reading and to learn about their world. I will say this quickly because I know that a lot of the discussion, and I'm looking forward to the discussion, is going to be on part to whole based methods. And so I'll say phonics has always been a part to whole method. It has always been in any good literacy program. However, it needs to be put in its proper perspective. It's meant to be short-termed and not extended past the third grade. When I go to the next slide, I'm going to tell you why I'm worried about this. And very generally, we need to know that the ontology of being bilingual, what it means, your brain is wired differently if you're bilingual than if you're monolingual. And yet we insist on using monolingual pedagogies to apply to teaching kids to read in various languages. Okay, so what have we learned from the past? So I've been around long enough, and most of you have too probably, to be through a few of these initiatives about how to teach reading. And one of the things that we know is that past initiatives designed to improve reading instruction has not achieved the desired goals. So some of you may remember an initiative called Reading First that was around from about 2004 to about 2010. IES did an extensive evaluation of this program and said, yep, it helped kids learn to decode okay. There was statistically significant differences in how kids decoded, but no significant difference in kids' comprehension. So it worked pretty well in the first and second grade. In the third grade, when you really got to talk about comprehension, it didn't work so well. And it did not improve student engagement in reading at all. And to me, that's one of the saddest outcomes. Pal and Scar P. David Pearson et al. Have just released a synthesis of research on comprehension studies. And so they're saying, okay, so where did reading first leave us short? It left us short on the comprehension. What do we know about comprehension? So first of all, they say the reason we learn to read is to learn to understand what we're reading. And they too evaluated over 200 different studies that were conducted during the Reading First era that match the evaluation studies, and say we really taught kids to be pretty good decoders, but we didn't improve comprehension at all. And August and Shanahan, I think, are their synthesis of research on emerging bilingual kids are particularly important for this topic in this conversation, because what they said is that we had good evidence that kids who were learning English became as fluent in decoding as kids who were native English speakers. But what they didn't have was comprehension and their writing, and kids struggled with that. So we have these lessons from the past. Why is it that we seem to be hell-bent, sorry to my mother for saying that word, hell-bent on repeating the mistakes of the past? So I'm going to give you an example. This is New Mexico's proposed structured literacy plan. Now notice we've known forever that we ought not to be doing phonics past the 3rd grade, and yet what we see here is a K-12 structured literacy plan. And you see all those little words that you can't see, which is the plan for instruction from K to 12, and actually it starts in preschool. What I want to focus on, though, are some things that are particularly of concern. In K to 3, it is proposed that all the kids have a 90-minute reading block. So my question is, does this increase to 180 minutes in a bilingual or a dual language program? That's a long time. The 90-minute block is dedicated to providing instruction in the 5 essential elements of beginning reading, which are phonological awareness, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, and comprehension. Comprehension is in there. It's in the words. Let's give them credit for it. However, additional instructional time will need to be scheduled to ensure adequate time to teach other areas of literacy, such as writing and oral language. I see this as a recipe for disaster for emerging bilingual kids. And this is the state of New Mexico, where they have a kid or two who are emerging bilingual kids. For grades K to 3, more than 90 minutes should be provided for students who have not met grade level reading goals, which I think is another huge concern. If kids aren't getting it, we give them an additional dose called an intervention of more of the stuff that wasn't working for them in the first time. So there's no oracy and no writing in this plan, and those things have to be scheduled independently. So we've learned this from the past, but we seem to be wanting to repeat it. So what's at stake? What's at stake is that we repeat the mistakes of the past, which we are wont to do. We lose another generation. I say that very sincerely and very from a worried abuela. I'm also a grandma too of emerging bilingual kids. We miss out on an opportunity to develop bilingualism and biliteracy. And with what we know about especially Spanish-speaking kids and the benefits of bilingualism and biliteracy and our capabilities now to do it, what a tragedy if we don't develop and do what we know is in the best interest of these children. And worst of all is that we continue to blame children and their families for our failures to develop culturally responsive programs. So thank you. That's my 2 cents, and I look forward to the conversation.
Wow, Kathy, we can't wait to engage and let's hear from Jim. And I took copious notes here, because what you're saying is we have an opportunity not to repeat the same mistakes. So Jim, your turn.
Thank you, Amelia. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's also a real pleasure to share the virtual stage with Kathy Escamilla, whose work is outstanding and has influenced everything that's going on in schools for the past 30, 40 years. I'd also like to welcome all of the participants who are here. I hope that this fall has been a more smooth opening of schools and getting things going in schools than was the case last fall. It's been a difficult 18 months for both teachers and students and obviously parents also. And that's why I think it's really important that we have a coherent sense of what it is we're trying to do in our schools. And the point that I want to try and make is that we need to have whole school language policies, or more broader than that, whole school educational policies, particularly when we're talking about students who are seen as exceptional in some way. English language learners, multilingual students fall into that category. And very often in our schools, the mindset has been that the job of teaching the English language learners is the job of the ESL teacher. And the regular classroom teachers have a curriculum that they've got to teach, and that curriculum typically does not have built-in scaffolding for second language learners. And if that's the mindset in the school, a lot of those kids are going to fall behind. And we need to take account of the fact that we not only have to provide support for students learning the school language, but we also need to recognize that the students who are falling behind are not just English language learners. They're also students who are coming from low-income backgrounds, whose experiences outside of school have often involved poverty, lack of opportunities of various kinds, parents struggling to put food on the table, don't have money to buy books, they don't have money to buy iPads. They're often not in a position to take their kids to museums and do things that other more socially advantaged kids get to experience. And also, the students who are failing in our schools tend to be from communities whose culture, language, experiences have been excluded or disparaged, not just recently, but often over generations. And when the students who experience the most extreme difficulties in school fall into all three of those categories. And so a mindset that says, well, we just need to provide some English language support for students is missing out big time on what we need to be doing as a whole school community. So I'm going to go to the PowerPoint and give you some examples of what I mean in doing this. What you see on the screen is from a grade 4 classroom in a school in the Toronto area where colleagues of mine and I carried out some work a number of years ago, almost 20 years ago, where the goal of the project was to work with teachers to make languages visible in the classroom. And so teachers talked about their own experiences of learning languages. They asked students to share the languages that they knew in order to recognize these languages as accomplishments and assets. And you can see on the screen just the way one teacher asked students to write about their languages, to talk about them, and then to display this information for other kids to see and read. The big picture in terms of what I'm saying is in this diagram, or not diagram, but table, where basically it's saying if we want to devise and implement strategies that are going to be coherent, that are going to be evidence-based, we have to start by asking, well, who are the students who are failing academically right now? You know, what are their characteristics? And we really haven't done that in a systematic way. And as I said before, there are three categories of students that tend to experience academic difficulties. These categories overlap. For example, about 60% of the students coming from multilingual backgrounds are also experiencing the effects of low income and social disadvantage of various kinds. And many of these students are also coming from groups that have experienced racism over many generations. And so if we ask, what do we know about the causes or the opportunity gaps, as some researchers call them, the opportunity gaps that predict or are associated with the difficulties that these students have? You can see on the top of the table that, for example, with students coming from linguistically diverse backgrounds, failure to understand instruction due to a difference between the language of the home and the language of the school is a potential predictor of failure, but only if the school does very little to help the student to acquire the language. When we look at students coming from low socioeconomic status or low-income backgrounds, there's a variety of things there that schools are not in a position to do very much about. For example, housing segregation is not something that teachers in their classrooms can do much about. Housing segregation leads to school segregation, and we know that that has a variety of effects. When we look at students coming from communities that have been marginalized over many generations, they have experienced social discrimination, often low teacher expectations, stereotypes operating about the students and communities in the wider society, all of which adds up to a pattern of identity devaluation. So the next step then is to ask, well, what do we know from the research about evidence-based instructional strategies that can address these opportunity gaps? And we actually know a lot. The problem is we haven't put them together across these three categories. So for example, in terms of helping students acquire proficiency in the school language and catch up in literacy and other academic areas, teachers need to know how to scaffold comprehension and production of language across the curriculum. It's not just the job of the language specialist. It's not just the job of the ESL teacher. Every teacher needs to be prepared in both senses of that term to support students. And that means they need to know a lot about how long it takes students to catch up academically. They need to know some of the characteristics of what makes academic language more challenging for students to gain access to. And this is not something that all teachers have had the opportunity to learn. So when we talk about leadership in the school, leaders must ensure that teachers have the knowledge base to implement instructional strategies that are going to be effective. Many teachers in mainstream classrooms have not had much opportunity to find out much about language learning processes, bilingualism, or the role of students' home language in supporting their acquisition of the second language. As Kathy mentioned, the first language is an incredibly important foundation that we can build on in acquiring the second language. And this applies not just to bilingual programs. This is even more important in so-called monolingual or English-only classrooms. And a third focus in terms of helping linguistically diverse students catch up academically is to reinforce academic language across the curriculum. I think Kathy called this a focus on metalinguistic aspects of the language. This is all great, and it's happening in a number of classrooms, but often it doesn't go along with evidence-based instructional strategies that can address the negative effects of low socioeconomic status. And as I said, there's a lot of things related to poverty that schools can't do very much about. But there's one major thing that schools have a huge potential impact on, and that's our approach to literacy, to teaching reading and writing, and developing students' oral language more broadly. There's a huge amount of research that has been largely ignored in the United States that shows that one of the most potent variables predicting students' reading comprehension is the extent to which they become actively engaged with literacy from an early stage. In fact, the international research coming from massive studies carried out by the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in more than 70 countries around the world over the last 20 years. This research has shown that there's about a 1/3 overlap between the negative effects of low-income backgrounds, low socioeconomic backgrounds, and the positive effects of reading engagement. What this means is that schools could potentially push back about 1/3 of the negative effects of social disadvantage if we could get kids actively engaged with reading from a very early stage. And so when we find results like those that came from Reading First, that the strategies that were implemented in that $6 billion program had no impact on reading engagement, had no impact on reading comprehension, we've got to step back and ask, well, what evidence are we ignoring? And the evidence that we are ignoring is the fact that literacy engagement is a huge positive causal factor in terms of reading and writing development. When we look at students coming from communities that have been marginalized over a considerable period of time, we need to connect instruction to students' lives. We need to validate students' experiences. Often these students have had the status within the society of internal colonies. And we need to pursue a process of decolonization so that rather than indulging in or not challenging negative stereotypes about the community, rather than being complicit in some ways with the discrimination that students and communities have experienced, we need to actively challenge that. We need to decolonize instruction through linguistically and culturally sustaining pedagogy. And we need to valorize and build on the first and second language varieties that students bring to school. Often in bilingual programs, the variety of Spanish that students are bringing to school is not seen as an adequate variety. And students pick up the message from teachers that they don't really speak Spanish all that well, let alone English all that well. This is the antithesis of the identity affirmation that bilingual programs should be implementing. And so the whole focus has got to be on affirming student identities in association with academic engagement. And what we need to do in terms of developing whole school policies is to put these three categories together, these three evidence-based instructional responses that respond not only to the need for students to learn the school language and catch up academically, but also that address the effects of social disadvantage and the fact that many students who are coming from poverty backgrounds have had limited access to print in home and school. They may have very, very rich cultural experiences, but often they don't include access to print. And we need to address the devaluation of identity that many students who are coming from excluded or marginalized communities have experienced also. Let me just, in the last minute or two that I've got, let me just give you a couple of brief examples. This was a story, a dual language story written by a student in grade 6 who had come from Israel. He was in his first year of learning English. The teacher wanted to follow the curriculum expectations. It was an ESL class, but she wanted to do what grade 6 kids were supposed to be doing. And so she wanted students to be writing. She knew that if she asked students to write only in English, she might get 1 or 2 painful sentences out of them. So she asked students, if they wanted to, that they could read in their home, write in their home language. And then she found ways to help students go from that home language to English. In this case, there was a student in the school, or there was a teacher in the school who knew enough Hebrew to help Tomer to translate his story from Hebrew into English. And he learned an enormous amount of English in that process. If you had given him his story in English before he had written it, he would not have been able to read it. But listen to what Tomer says, or look at what Tomer says in terms of his assessment of this. He says, I think using your first language is so helpful because when you don't understand something after you've just come here, it's like beginning as a baby. That's an identity statement. You don't know English and you need to learn it all from the beginning. But if you already have it in another language, then it's easier. You can translate it and you can do it in your language too. And then it's easier to understand the second language. So what he's saying here in a very comprehensible way is basically what all of the research is saying, that there's a positive relationship between students' two languages. Just in terms of looking at literacy policy and addressing the issues related to socioeconomic status, there's some suggestions here about things we might ask ourselves in developing whole school approaches to literacy policy. I'm not going to go into detail because of time. If we look at identity and the whole process of decolonization, this was a project that a colleague of mine and I were involved in that involved Native Canadian, or what in Canada are called First Nations communities. It was a school within a school that focused on First Nations issues. And students worked with a First Nations artist whom you see on the right-hand side. And they created paintings that reflected their culture. And they reacted to what they were seeing other students doing by writing poetry. And the impact of this on students was phenomenal in terms of enabling them to see their culture as being valuable. And Cassandra by Zog expresses it extremely well. She says, "This experience gave me a gift of poetry. I started to develop a passion for poetry during this project. I didn't know I had this passion. Since this project, I've written and shared many pieces of poetry. Participating in this project was like hearing a collective voice telling me, we're proud of you, we care about you, you have a future. Being able to express my thoughts about who I am as an Ojibwe woman made me feel like I belonged and was connected to a larger community." She goes on to say, this was in conversation, and we were videotaping all of this. She says, "Take away identity, and what do you have? If you have a student that doesn't know who they are, do you think they care about what goes on in the classroom?" So in other words, when we look at what we know we can do to challenge the legacy of racism, and First Nations in Canada have experienced enormous and horrible racism over the last 150 years. When we look at how we can challenge the legacy, we know a lot. We have to focus and ask ourselves how we can work with communities, how we can work with students to affirm their experiences, to affirm their cultures and languages. So these are some considerations that would go into thinking about whole school language policies. It's not enough to focus just on providing English as a second language support. Okay, thank you.
So my head is like exploding, and I'm like, how are we going to put all of this together? But I think one of the things that stands out to me after hearing both of you is that, yes, research has made a powerful case for the importance of foundational skills, but research has also made a powerful case for many other aspects. And if we are not able to bring all the pieces together, we are not going to get better outcomes for kids. So I think it's really important. And I'm going to ask Lucia to see what questions need to be elevated from this introduction. But I think we all have a responsibility to provide guidance that truly helps educators bring these various forms of research findings together so they can actually be executed in a way that brings better outcomes for kids. Let's not pick and choose just the part that we like or that is easier. What both of you talked about is transformational. So let me go to Lucia first, and Mario, I'm going to ask you to jump in too. But Lucia, do we have a question that we need to elevate?
Yes, we do. We have a few very valuable questions. Thank you, audience, for picking the brains of our lifelong mentors, Jim Cummings and Kathy Escamilla. Maybe the last one we could start with. What advice do you have for a value proposition supporting biliteracy when the community is predominantly monolingual? The communicative value motivation is low, the identity is essentially monolingual, cognitive improvements are not yet ubiquitous or unequivocal in the school environment. So what is the hook?
Could you read the whole question again? I'm trying to get my head around who exactly the community is.
Absolutely. What advice do you have for a value proposition supporting biliteracy when the community is predominantly monolingual? When the communicative value motivation is low and identity is essentially homogeneously monolingual, and the cognitive improvements that come with bilingualism are not necessarily visible still. How can we hook the community, families, educators around this idea of biliteracy?
And I think this question is coming to us from Australia.
Oh, okay. I'm trying to get a sense for the question. So the community is monolingual, but I'm going to ask an indelicate question. Okay, is the community white, or it's a non-white community that has been, for whatever reason, over generations, forced to learn English and leave a heritage language behind? Because that will make a difference in how I respond.
So while predominantly
Answer
white.
is predominantly white.
Predominantly white. So you're trying to, we tend to, it's ironic because in this country, after all these years, now we're finding the same people who beat Spanish out of so many Latino kids, Latinx kids in the day are now clamoring to get their kids into dual language programs. And so it's really ironic that that tends to be the situation in your community, where the white majority monolingual people aren't seeing the value of biliteracy. And I guess I wish I had some good advice, but I don't know your community. I will say this, however, knowing my community and how people think, if somehow majority community people think their children are going to be left behind, they clamor for it. So all of a sudden, what do your kids need to get ahead? They need music lessons, and they need to learn a second language by the time they're 3. All of a sudden, they're lining up for programs. They're paying for private preschools, and so that's sort of you don't want your children to get behind. And no pun intended for the No Child Left Behind business we've just been through, because that was a whole different issue. But that motivates people to think that they're not preparing their children for a future. And you know, I think that might be one way to motivate kids, although I'm wondering what languages you're interested in also. And then Jim, you probably have something to.
Yeah, let me just make a couple of points. One is preschool education is really important. And one of the many studies that have been ignored in the United States context that has huge implications for what we should be doing in schools and in preschools comes from New Zealand. It was a longitudinal study that followed kids from preschool ages right through to age 16. And the researchers looked at, they observed in a variety of preschools across New Zealand. And they looked at 5 different characteristics of the preschools that became associated with later literacy development. And the one that we're interested in this context is what they call literacy saturation. And what they found was that preschools that had lots of books around, lots of books that students could reach up to and look at, had reading going on for kids. In other words, activities that focus not on teaching phonics, but on getting kids connected to reading, building up that affective connection to reading. Those kids were outperforming all comparison groups, even at the age of 16. And so this kind of finding suggests that preschool is really important as a way of connecting up students' identities with books, with literacy, and realizing that there's payoff to books, because those are the kids who are going to want to read when they get to school.
Yeah.
Secondly, if we look at the K-12 context, we need to get kids doing powerful things with language and literacy. If students are writing dual language books that go up in the web, if they're getting all kinds of positive feedback from parents, from peers, from, in the case of Tomer, from his friends back in Israel, they will want to write, they will want to read. Literacy becomes part of their identity. And you can look at a variety of examples of this. I've got lots of them in the book that I recently published, that highlights the fact that if kids engage with language and literacy in what I'm calling powerful ways, and by powerful I mean identity affirming ways, they will want to keep on doing it. And so even if there's not a strong literacy base in the community, even if parents are not highly educated, we know that students can succeed in school, but we need to start doing the right things. And the right things are evidence-based. And there's one major part of the evidence that has been totally ignored in programs like Reading First and others. And that's the fact that literacy engagement should start at the earliest possible stages. And we have a huge amount of power as educators to make that happen.
Jim, let me ask you a question, because what you're saying is so critical, and there is a ton of research supporting dialogic reading, right? Which is this large amount of truly interactive reading that starts early on. What is it that attracts people to these quick, small picture versus this more complex, larger? You said literacy, both of you keep saying the word literacy, literacy in language. So how do we do this? How do we get people to start thinking bigger and also more complex?
Hopefully, programs that focus on providing kids with books, developing students' oral language through reading, getting kids talking about the books that they're reading. The positive results that are coming out and will come out from these programs will force people, and by people here I mean not just educators, but researchers and policymakers, to look more closely at what the research is actually saying, and not cherry pick research that just fits our particular biases at a particular point in time.
Kathy, you want to add anything to this?
No, I completely agree. I also, with regard to reading in preschool, that does require books. And so one of the things, your question was so good, Amelia. I think that we think that there are quick fixes for things, and there's not. Because if there were, I would have joined some exercise program years ago where you only had to go for 2 weeks. Instead, I find out it's a lifetime proposition, and I'm like, I'm out of here. So I think of the development of being a literate person as sort of the same way. It's not something that you do in preschool and then hope you're done with it. It's something that you do, and you do because you learn to enjoy it. You learn the benefits of it. You, for all of the reasons that are beyond just, can I say A and B? It's a healthy thing for a human being, for the development of a human being. And I don't think that we have kind of embraced that completely.
Mario, I'm turning to you. Do you have any questions or thoughts right now?
Yeah, I'm looking at the 5 accelerators that we began our conversation around, and I'm thinking about the red thread that connects what Jim and Kathy are reminding us of in terms of honoring the home language and cultures. And I'm looking at accelerator number 2, this idea of knowledge building and increasing the volume of reading. For a teacher, I'm thinking providing texts in home languages, right, would be the first step into making sure that knowledge building is happening across multiple languages. And Jim gave us very specific examples of students engaging in knowledge building projects that show their thinking, their knowledge, the building of their knowledge. I want to break down the accelerator number 1, which seems to be really complex for teachers. There's been a reigniting of the teaching of foundational skills, the automatic word recognition process, phonemic awareness, phonics, and fluency. Teachers want to get this right. And it often seems like the hardest part, the hardest accelerator, if you will, to include home language, to understand a multilingual perspective within the quest of teaching foundational literacy skills in English. I want to invite our guest speakers to talk about, how do you teach foundational skills through an equitable multilingual lens? What does that look like?
Where to start? So I think that you can't think about foundational skills as the same in all languages. And so one of the, I think the huge mistakes that we make in this country is we develop a set of teaching experiences around foundational skills that are really English centric. And then we tell teachers, just go and do the same thing we just did in English in Spanish. And I think that's a mistake. I think we have to be true to the internal structures of both of the languages. And that means doing a little bit more work. And more, by more work, I don't mean for the teachers. I mean the people who are creating curriculum and textbooks and policy. I agree with you, Mario. I think teachers want to do their very, very best. And I would hate for somebody to be holding me accountable for the first class of kids that I taught way back in 1971. And I think the same is even more true today. But there's something that I'm really, really worried about. And I'm not worried about teacher education per se. I am worried about the mandates in teacher education programs now that will keep professors from teaching the very things that we know that are going to accelerate reading development. So I'm worried about the teachers we're producing, because we have extended now the foundation skills is all you need to do, theory and ideology, to the teaching of how we teach methods of reading in universities. In our state, there is a mandate that took away all of the culturally relevant teaching methodologies and replaced them with methods for teaching reading using the foundational skills for structured literacy. And that's pretty scary to me. I also want to say, if we think for any reason that our schools are back to normal, you haven't been in a school lately. So one thing that a beginning young teacher needs more than anything else is support. Support in the way of a coach, support in the way. I was really lucky when I first started teaching that I had a lady next door who, I mean, she knew stuff and she was nice enough to share it with me. She didn't keep it to herself. But now people who are instructional coaches are in classrooms, because we can't find enough teachers to be in classrooms now. We can't find enough substitute teachers. So we're starting out sort of not in a normal way where we have a full complement of all the teachers and the coaches and the support systems that our young teachers need. So I think they're confused. I think they're not getting the support they need. And I don't think it's their fault. That's not a solution, but that's kind of where we are right now. And I think we have to acknowledge where we are before we can figure out how to get better.
And I think that's the responsibility that I've been talking about, right? How do you provide guidance that brings the parts together? And I do want to highlight that our IES study, we had ARC Core, the kindergarten program, being evaluated, independently evaluated. And it is a program that organizes the units around really great, engaging topics. Like kindergarten goes through ecology, zoology, entomology. And those are really, kids love bugs. They love bugs. And so they learn to read in this context of knowledge building. And at the end of this experimental study that had business of usual, that you separate everything, versus a comprehensive integrated solution that built knowledge, vocabulary, engagement, and also took care of foundational skills, we found not only like better reading comprehension, better letter naming, better motivation to read, decreased gender stereotypes. But check this out. When the kids went from kindergarten to first grade, the first grade teachers identified the kids that went through our core as being much more likely to have confidence, to know what books they wanted to read, so they were able to read independently. Their verbal expression, their collaboration, their love of learning, and interest in science was significantly higher. So it's not a question of this or that. It's a question of design. We can bring things together in a way that truly transforms outcomes. It's not my webinar, but I'm getting so excited just by hearing them talk. Oh, it's not a choice, people. It's an and, it's not an or. Jim, what do you want to add to this?
Just one quick point. If we look at why there is a socioeconomic gap in terms of reading development, it's not because kids from low-income backgrounds don't learn decoding skills. They generally do. It's because there's a 5-year advanced training process going on in middle-class homes, where people like you and me and many in the audience are reading to our kids from the time they're toddlers, crawling around the place. They're exposed to books. Parents are talking about books. In many families that are growing up in poverty, there's also a lack of access to print. And as I said, there may be rich cultural things going on in the homes, but print is often not one of them. And so the reason that you have that socioeconomic gap is not because middle-class parents are teaching foundational skills like phonics to their kids at age 2 and 3. They're reading to their kids, they're exposing them to books, they're building up that affective connection with books. And so if we want to enable students from low-income backgrounds, which includes many multilingual students, to bridge that gap, we have to focus on literacy engagement from the earliest stages possible. That's preschool, where it exists. And then when students come to school, when they come to kindergarten and grade 1, an attitude out there in some schools as well, let's put away the books, let's focus only on these 5 foundational skills and keep them separate. And then when kids have learned how to decode in 2 or 3 years, then we can give them books. That's absolutely nonsense in terms of what the research is saying.
I have, Lucia, let's get Juan Garcia's question up to the group. Go ahead.
Sure. Juan Garcia shares the science of reading addressing early literacy in English is readily available to districts. Many different options. However, such assistance in regards to intervention for Spanish language learners is hard to find. This member of the audience is talking about step-by-step process of addressing individual building blocks of early literacy, from initial screener to a series of lesson plans, coaching, modeling, etc. Do you have any suggestions?
I have 2. So the Boulder Valley school system has just developed Year at a Glance with exactly that kind of look at curriculum and planning, and a scope and sequence for teaching Spanish, two ways: Spanish for kids who are Spanish speakers when they come to school, and then for kids who are learning Spanish as a second language in their dual language programs. And I would be happy to look up the email and send it to you, Mario and Amelia, to be sent. So I would strongly recommend that one. And then San Antonio Independent School District has also developed a very nice Year at a Glance look at how Spanish is different from English, and how English and Spanish interact, because that's the thing in dual language programs, that you can't just consider the languages as 2 separate things. You have to consider how they interact and how you want to teach in a way that maybe starts here but includes this and joins the 2 as you go on. So Olivia Dundas and the San Antonio Independent School District have good stuff to share.
And I think the issue that Juan brings up, though, is that it's this afterthought, right? So
Yes.
we think, so I think that's the big issue. But I do want to say that Jim worked with Lucia on our multilingual guide that is like a coaching on the side that does not leave multilingual perspectives or things that we need to think about when we are coaching kids behind, and in truly through a nested perspective. So we will put a link to that also, so you can check it out. It's my favorite part of everything that I do. It's that multilingual coaching guide, because it helps every kid, it helps everybody. So do we have another question we want to ask, or do we want to, we are almost out of time, so I almost want to put the questions on hold, and I want to ask both of you to give your closing thoughts. Definitely an hour is not enough with you. We have to have you back. I mean, we need to break things into, we will do a series together because there's just too much for you to teach us. But based on what you are seeing and hearing, what are you most excited about? And the second part of that is, what is one thing you want to leave people with? Like at the end of this webinar, you want them to hold a thought or a question. What is it that you want them to do? So Jim, let's start with you, and then we'll go to Kathy.
Okay, let me give you an example. What I want to say is just to repeat the point that I made about literacy engagement being crucial. That's what the research is saying. And literacy engagement doesn't mean literacy engagement only in English. It also means literacy engagement in the first language. And we need to work with parents to find ways in which we can get that message across and support them in helping their kids develop literacy in two languages. And let me just give you an example of what one school in the Toronto area did. They did this out of intuition, not because they were very familiar with the research. This is an inner city school where more than 90% of the kids were coming from non-English speaking backgrounds. Because they wanted parents to have access to books in the home, they used some of the extra funds they got to keep the school library open between 4 o'clock in the afternoon and 7 o'clock in the evening, 4 days a week. So between Monday and Thursday, the school library was there so that when moms or dads came to pick up their kids, they could go right into the school library. They had a collection of multilingual books in the languages of the community. They had books on all kinds of topics. Parents and kids could check out the books to bring home. They could read the books in the library. And this is exactly the kind of initiative that the research is suggesting we pursue. And yet, this is the only school that I know of in Canada or elsewhere which has done this. But there's a lot of things that we can do, but we have to do it on a whole school basis. And that means school leaders need to take the initiative in getting this discussion going. And school leaders also need to be informed about what the research is saying.
Thank you. Kathy.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The question is like, we tend to be able to say all the time, well, we can't do this because, but we don't ask the question, well, what can we do? And, you know, there's a nice invention that I'm not very good at. It's called the internet. And my God, it opens up the world to all of these languages and all of these stories and all of these possibilities to communicate with people around the world like we're doing right now. And we don't take advantage of it. And I can't think of a way to engage a teenage kid more in saying, I want to learn more about my heritage than getting on a chat with someone from the home country and say, oh my God, that's really interesting. Read this book. Oh, that's really interesting. The internet opens up ways of doing literacy to us that we have not even begun to tap into. And I know that people out there, well, in my community, we don't have Wi-Fi, we don't have, well, but that doesn't mean, what can we do? What can we do? And we can lobby people to make sure that all of our kids have Chromebooks and all of our kids have Wi-Fi and all of our kids have that. They're all engaged in using technology. We have to be engaged and we have to understand that that's not our enemy, that that's something that we can use to do all of the things that Jim was talking about. We have lots of people in our communities who can come into schools and tell stories and read books, and we don't always take advantage of those resources that are there. And I know we've had a pandemic and we don't necessarily want a lot of people in schools, but again, all the more reason to use mediums like Zoom to do this work. We can do it. I think we've just lacked imagination as to how to do it.
Thank you so much. I do want to finish with Larissa Cortez is saying, as I listen to this webinar, I'm organizing Spanish and English books for a book giveaway this weekend. Yeah. So go forward, Larissa. I want to thank you so much for this time. I don't think it's enough time. I'm thinking that Mario and I and Lucia will get together to see how we can bring you back. But we do want to remind you that next month we have another webinar with Dr. Alfred Tatum, and it's going to be around his new book on going deep in literacy in language, just like what Kathy and Jim have been talking about. He's going to continue this conversation. So please join us, and thank you so much for everything you do. Please look forward to our email with the webinar recording and also the resources that were mentioned here. Thank you very much.